This particular portrait was painted on the shores of Georgian Bay. And yeah, come on in, you guys. Just feel free to zoom on in. And Pointo Barrel is probably the closest town. And the reason really that I felt attracted to this particular picture is that John Irving is the author I was most familiar with, virtually the only one I was familiar with. And I've read quite a few of his books and seen quite a few of the movies that were adapted to it. So that got me to thinking, ironically enough, about a song. We won't sing it for you, but I will give you some of the lyrics. And since we are on Canadian artists and so on, it's also fitting that it comes from a group called the Tragically Hip. And the song is called Courage. And in that song, they are basically on the dance floor, as you can imagine, maybe sweating to the last dance, and then the music stops. And you've probably all been in that position where you're wondering if you keep dancing, and you're waiting to see if you recognize the first few strains of notes that start emanating from the stage or the speakers. And in this case, he's talking about watching the band through a bunch of dancers. And when that music stops, he's asking quickly, something familiar, something familiar. And basically, that is the way we all sort of react when we see something. If it's not something we're familiar with, we're not as inclined to engage with it. So the subject matter of a lot of these paintings, I think, is very important, as you probably noticed in some of the other pieces. If you've been out to any of those landscapes, to Savage Coast, Cove, or to the Okanagan Valley, it would resonate with you. But for me, that significance didn't stop just with that, because again, ironically enough, or as luck would have it, they also quote another very famous Canadian author in that song, Hugh MacLennan. And it's a line that comes from The Last Watch of the Night. And in it, the quote runs something like, and the explanation of anything important any one of us do is that the human tragedy consists of the necessity of living with the consequences under pressure. And that is sort of paraphrasing, because he actually leaves out a pretty important bit in that. When he talks about the consequences under pressure really refers to the consequences of our actions that may have been performed under pressure. And whether it was under pressure or not, the consequences of actions is a very, very familiar theme in both Hugh MacLennan's work and in John Irving's. The smallest, slightest disturbance or simple twist of fate, quote another lyric, Bob Dylan, can drastically affect the outcome of the plot, the drama, and the trauma, which become very intrinsic to John Irving's work. I think it is in A Widow for a Year, where they talk about a seemingly very insignificant moment where you're taking driver's lessons, and if you remember those, whether it was you or your children, they're pretty tedious, talking about how you shouldn't turn your wheel when you approach an intersection. And of course, this lesson becomes magnified when a family's car is struck from behind, putting them into the oncoming traffic and killing their beloved boys. And this becomes the entire plot structure driver for the rest of that novel. So those two authors seem to engage in that sort of vehicle for forwarding their stories. The other only point I'll make about this is that when John Hartman first started these paintings, he does not consider himself a portrait artist. He is a landscape artist, and undertook this as a way to, again, show the link between the landscape and some of the authors. And many of the first portraits that he did start adding to his landscapes around Georgian Bay were just sort of the local characters. And they actually became a part of a whimsy. If you notice Savage Codes, there's sort of a huge dog stuck down there. And in this case, it's hard not to notice there's just floating desk objects here. So that kind of whimsy brought it in. And again, when you're talking about John Irving, he has, some very specific biographical details that recur in a lot of his literary work. So he's heavily involved in wrestling. He was raised in New England, born in New England. And you might beg the question, well, how does he become a Canadian author? He married a Canadian wife, who's actually a book agent who he met in Toronto when he was promoting one of his books. And they've since moved to Canada. They live in Toronto, which again appears quite frequently in his books. So all of these familiar places, familiar faces, seem to come up in many of these artists. And really, that's the inspiration for the connection of our next song by the Beatles, In My Life.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone, and some remain. All these places had their moments with lovers and friends. I still can recall. Some are dead and some are living. In my life, I love them all. But of all these friends and lovers, there is no one compares with you. And these memories lose their meaning when I think of love as something new. Though I know I'll never ever lose affection for people and things that went before, I know I'll often stop and think about them in my